Welcome back here on Live Now from Fox, 6:32 on the East Coast and 3:32 on the West Coast. My name is Josh Breslow, and I'm here to bring you all of your top stories and live events from across the country and across the world. I do want to bring you new information here on the case against Luigi Mangione, the man accused of killing the CEO of UnitedHealthcare in Midtown Manhattan. A judge today dismissing the terrorism charges against Mangione in New York State case over the killing of Brian Thompson, but kept the state's second-degree murder charges. Mangione's lawyers argued that the New York case and a parallel federal death penalty prosecution amount to double jeopardy, which the judge did reject. This was Mangione's first court appearance in the state case since back in February, and you can see the photos here from inside of the courtroom. Do want to discuss all of this and what happens next, so let's bring in Phil Harvey, criminal defense attorney. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us today.
Thanks for having me, Josh.
All right, so what is kind of the legal background here that led to that terrorism charge, the state terrorism charge, being dismissed there by the judge? How does all of that kind of play out?
Well, New York added terrorism as one of the components of a possible first-degree murder charge in the wake of 9/11. And under New York law, the 13th or 14th condition that can support a first-degree murder conviction in New York is if the murder was carried out with a terroristic intent. And so in New York, you can also file a motion to dismiss and ask the trial judge to review the grand jury minutes and determine whether or not the prosecution's evidence supports the case going forward to trial. The legal standard that the judge is supposed to use is he's supposed to assume, even assuming that all the evidence presented to the grand jury was true, would it, if assumed true, prove every element of the crime? And what he decided in the hearing today was that in this case, the prosecution did not present any evidence which could support a terroristic intent for this murder.
What is that relationship between the state charges, the federal charges in the case here, especially now that that terrorism charge has been dismissed?
Well, there's no official relationship between state and federal charges. Throughout the United States, we have a theory called dual sovereignty, which provides that anything the state court does is not related to what the federal court does. And this incidentally goes to that double jeopardy issue you brought up a moment ago. What's likely to happen is the state prosecution is going to be in communication with the federal prosecutors, and on a pragmatic and practical level, I think there's already been some cooperation. And in fact, even though double jeopardy does not technically apply because of dual sovereignty, New York has a state law that prohibits prosecutions after there's already been a guilty verdict. And so it appears that the state and federal prosecutors probably agreed to let this New York State case go forward first to avoid that law. And the Constitution does not provide any relief under dual sovereignty. But certainly with the New York terrorism charges being dismissed, this may increase the pressure somewhat, but certainly increase the motivation on behalf of the federal prosecutors to try to make sure those terrorism charges stick.
One thing that's interesting is this case has garnered a lot of attention over the months. You have people who are Luigi Mangione supporters. They show up in court. They don't know him, but we know that about 3 of the rows there inside the courtroom today were filled with members of the public. We are told they were mostly young women, and some of them were wearing shirts that said "Free Mangione" or "Free Luigi." So my question for you: how could that make it difficult to seat a jury in the future? Obviously, the trial not happening here in a month or two, but in the future, how could that make things difficult for seating an impartial jury?
Well, if you think about what an ideal fair trial would look like, you would have jurors who don't know anything about the case, anything about any of the parties involved or the witnesses, and who are prepared to follow the law regardless of what conclusion it brings them to. Anytime you have a lot of publicity in a case, it makes it harder to seat that ideal jury, both for the prosecution and for the defense. There's a risk that they could be biased in either direction. At a minimum, I think what we can expect when this case does go to trial is that it's going to take a little bit longer, perhaps a lot longer, to try to pick that jury. You could, in some instances, see a motion for a venue change, but when a case has this much national attention, there's not much assurance that another venue would have fewer publicity or fewer tainted jurors.
On that note, as you're talking about the next steps here, I mean, you already talked about a potential change of venue filing, but are there additional maybe appeals filings that the defense, aside from that, likely to make in light of the judge's current ruling?
I don't know necessarily on the double jeopardy, although the double jeopardy decision could prompt the defense to consider a pretrial appeal. Certainly, we do have 3 pending due process motions. The judge today also, in addition to dismissing the terrorism charge and dismissing the double jeopardy objection, or ruling against the defense on the double jeopardy issue, he did order 3 additional hearings, one on Fifth Amendment issues and whether or not Mr. Mangione's statements can come in, a Fourth Amendment issue in terms of whether or not the evidence was gathered in violation of search and seizure constitutional rights, as well as a hearing on what witnesses can and can't testify about the identity of the person depicted in the surveillance footage. So we do have certainly some more pretrial motions. I don't know that we'll see any pretrial appeals.
All right. Phil Harvey, thank you so much for taking the time to join us here and help break it down. Of course, we're keeping an eye on the case, and we know that there will be another hearing later on this year, so I'm sure we'll have you back. Anything we missed, anything you want to make sure to add here before I let you go?
Well, obviously, we didn't even mention that there is also a Pennsylvania case waiting. So I think we're going to see these cases pending for quite a while. We can expect 3 trials in this. Although I guess the last thing I would leave you with, Josh, is that with the first-degree murder charge disappearing, life without parole is off the table. And that does potentially open the possibility for a little more leeway in terms of defense negotiations, but that is entirely up to the defense. Thanks, Josh.
Yeah, we'll definitely see how it plays out. Phil, thank you again for being here. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Josh.